Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. It's time yet again to go charging into battle against the dragon, the discussion on the APA's guidelines for men and boys. There's a lot to get to, continuing on through this article, so I don't want to start off with too long of a preamble, but this section does kind of repeat a few things that I've already talked about in the first video, so there will be sections that I'll be glossing over a bit, and areas that I'll be stringing together for more streamlined discussion. That being said, let's get to it. Prior to the second wave feminist movement in the 1960s, all psychology was the psychology of men. Most major studies were done only on white men and boys, who stood in as proxies for humans as a whole. Researchers assumed that masculinity and femininity were opposite ends of a spectrum, and healthy psychology entailed identifying strongly with the gender roles conferred by a person's biological sex. Again, glossing over the first claim because I addressed this already, but what about this totally bizarre second claim here? Where are they finding these researchers? A Freudian diary? I have to wonder if the person who wrote this article has ever even taken a psychology course, because if they had, they would realize that there are many different schools of thought and different methods of practicing in psychology, implying that the doctrine of psychology as a whole is or was populated by a ubiquitous group of researchers that would have made such claims is definitely intellectually dishonest. Let me give you a few examples of different psychological models just off the top of my head. Behaviorism, cognitive behaviorism, person-centered, Gestalt, existential, positive. I can tell you with reasonable confidence that researchers from precisely zero of these schools of thought would have made claims of psychological health based on one's identification with the appropriate gender roles. Unlike feminist and, to a certain extent, psychodynamic therapies, read Freudian psychodynamic therapies, gender was really not a frequent subject of discussion in a lot of these models, and let it be known that most of these are not especially new models of psychology either. So, yeah, kinda caught you talking out your butt with that one, didn't we? But just as this old psychology left out women and people of color and conformed to gender role stereotypes, it also failed to take men's gendered experiences into account. Once psychologists began studying the experiences of women through a gender lens, it became increasingly clear that the study of men needed the same gender-aware approach, says Levant. Regarding the first sentence, not focusing on is by far not the same as excluding. This is a common theme that has been bothering me a lot throughout this discussion. Even if some research in the past used mainly white male participants, though who was the most common research participant is not the same as who made the most use out of this particular field, because we can definitively say that women used a lot of the old services, ineffective though they might have been. This does not mean that the research was then excluding other groups. Excluding implies a certain level of intentionality behind it. This is one of the ways that people who write articles like these set out to demonize older research. They conflate the ideas of exclusion and non-focus and act like these old researchers were setting out exclusively to treat psychology as a he-man women haters club, rather than an ill-informed, women really aren't all that different and likely wouldn't have that different of results tendency at best, and a patronizing, why would we worry about women's results when they don't generally care about this stuff anyway attitude at worst. And as for culture, well, we were a lot more of a homogenized society back in psychology's early days, weren't we? Hardly a surprise there. Now, before you jump down my throat here, I am not saying that these old-fashioned attitudes weren't an issue, because obviously, as we well know, and I frequently argue, men and women and people of different cultures do have very different needs in psychology, and they need to have different approaches to reflect that. But acting like these approaches are the same as a very deliberate, we are setting out to exclude these groups because we don't care about them / they don't matter, is not only wrong, but it's a polarizing attitude that makes it sound like the first guard psychologists were actively bad people rather than products of their time. Sure, there are a lot of bad practices throughout the history of psychology that modern psychologists cringe at now, but there's a difference between people doing things that way because that's just what they did at the time, or we're trying to help but in misguided ways, and we don't care about you or your needs at all. And it's important to acknowledge this difference if we want to have an honest discussion about how to better approach things. Now, that being said, apparently these guys' idea about how to better approach things is to argue that we need to take men's gendered experiences into account. You know, if the old research was supposedly so focused on gender role stereotypes, then you'd think that looking at things through a gendered lens would be the very last thing that we would want to do. If they didn't have a solid grounding on how gender roles worked back then what makes you think you've clearly got it all figured out now? Because if you ask me, a lot of the things they talk about in this gendered lens they're using for this discussion is going to lead to a heck of a lot more harm than good. And on that note, let's just go ahead and see what that looks like, shall we? The main thrust of the subsequent research is that traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, is on the whole harmful. Men socialized in this way are less likely to engage in healthy behaviors. As you can see, they're taking a very broad concept like traditional masculinity, and they're already falling into their own gender role stereotypes. Only, rather than telling men that they will be mentally healthy if they subscribe to these roles, they're telling them that these traits are in fact harmful. So really, they've just flipped the use of these gender role stereotypes on their head. I mean, let's look at some of the examples they've listed. Stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression. First of all, this is a rather narrow and limited view of traditional masculinity that they've constructed in their own right. Seems to me like they've taken the traits that are easiest to swing in the direction of appearing negative to the layman, and have conveniently left out other examples of behavior that could also fall into the quote-unquote traditionally masculine spectrum. Traits like courage, protectiveness, self-sacrifice, confidence. Seems like the sorts of things that you'd be inclined to leave out if you had a certain agenda in mind, like claiming that traditional masculinity caused more harm than good, isn't it? But more than that, you can see that they've even ignored the fact that these 4 examples they have provided can have both positive and negative effects themselves. Someone who is stoic, sure, perhaps sometimes they might have a harder time expressing emotions, or even a lack of desire to express emotions a lot of the time. But someone who is stoic can also set aside unhelpful emotionality in order to be a strong leader or to make important tough choices. Someone who is competitive can strive to become a success in business or can enjoy healthy competition with their peers in games. Someone who is dominant may be dominant because of an excess of charisma and attract lots of friends and feminine attention and have the confidence to make a lot of important social and business connections. Even aggression can help men living in underprivileged and perhaps even dangerous conditions to protect themselves and their family. What I'm getting at here is that you can't just bang off a list of traits and say, here's why these traits are harmful. It doesn't work like that. Any given trait has its uses and its problems depending on when and how it manifests. Obviously, a man expressing dominance and aggression in Sunny Acres old folks' home is more likely to cause problems, but that same man might be saving lives with those traits in the army. But wait a minute, look at the kinds of things they go on to talk about in the rest of this paragraph. For example, a 2011 study led by Kristen Springer, PhD, of Rutgers University, found that men with the strongest beliefs about masculinity were only half as likely as men with more moderate masculine beliefs to get preventative health care. And in 2007, researchers led by James Mahalik, PhD, of Boston College, found that the more men conformed to masculine norms, the more likely they were to consider as normal risky health behaviors such as heavy drinking, using tobacco, and avoiding vegetables, and to engage in these risky behaviors themselves. They talk about how traditional masculinity is harmful, and they go on to focus on healthcare and diet choices. So if I were to go for 3 weeks binge drinking every other day without eating a single green vegetable, are you going to tell me that this is a masculine norm, or just that I'm making unhealthy dietary choices? This is such an odd link to focus on because there are a number of reasons why someone might not want to see the doctor, or might not like eating their broccoli, that are completely unrelated to masculine norms. But let's just examine one example scenario. John works 2 jobs full-time in order to pay the bills and care for his family. John really doesn't have time to take a day off to go to the doctor, not that he feels like he needs to go anyway, because he needs to be bringing in as much money as possible or he'll just fall further into debt. Now, John does indeed smoke, but it's a vice that he picked up when he was young and has tried to quit many times and failed, so he just keeps up with it to deal with the stress at this point. He eats most of his meals out of a can because it allows him to save more money, health choices be darned. Now, sure, you might argue that John is displaying some possibly unhealthy masculine behaviors by this paper's standards. John is being stoic and not letting the stress of the situation stop him from doing what he needs to get done. John is also quite dominant and aggressive, too, trying to make bargains wherever possible to save money. And sure, these traits might be causing John to engage in some poor health choices, but then I would tell you that John doesn't exist and that this is the story of my mom. This scenario wasn't intended for me to present my anecdotal evidence as some kind of gotcha that I use to discount their findings. It's just intended to demonstrate that picking these specific traits and focusing on them like they're some kind of man problem is a massive oversimplification that simultaneously generalizes men's behavior and also misses the cases when these behaviors manifest in women as well. It doesn't make sense to take these traits and say traditional masculinity is harmful when you could instead be far more inclusive, comprehensive, and sound less like you're attacking one gender to pick specific behaviors and point out both the harmful and helpful aspects. You can even state that these behaviors might tend to be more common in one sex over the other. At least this comes across as informational rather than blaming. After all, I don't want to come across as claiming that there aren't behaviors that are more common in men or women. Of course there are. And it could even be useful to explore why certain behaviors might be more common in one sex. But what isn't useful is then to oversimplify things to the point where you're only talking about half the picture in why and how these behaviors manifest that way, especially the uncharitable half. But let's continue. This masculine reluctance towards self-care extends to psychological help. Research led by Omar Yousaf, PhD, found that men who bought into traditional notions of masculinity were more negative about seeking mental health services than those with more flexible gender attitudes. Oh hey, I have a really fantastic idea to get men to want to access psychological services. Tell them their masculinity is harmful to them. Got 'em. For this reason, mental health professionals need to be aware that men are often reluctant to admit vulnerability, says Frederick Rabinowitz, PhD, a psychologist at the University of Redlands in California who has stewarded the new guidelines since 2005 when he was president of APA Division 51, Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. Ugh, this kind of statement drives me bonkers in freaking yonkers. This is like looking at a cube head-on and calling it a square without orienting yourself to see the full 3D picture. Sure, plenty of men might be hesitant to admit vulnerability, but to say that this is only because of traditionally masculine traits is only one piece of the pie. Why might a man who has these traits be hesitant to admit vulnerability? Is it because of the next line these guys say? Because of the way many men have been brought up, to be self-sufficient and able to take care of themselves, any sense that things aren't okay needs to be kept secret, Rabinowitz says. Part of what happens is men who keep things to themselves look outward and see that no one else is sharing any of the conflicts that they feel inside. That makes them feel isolated. They think they're alone. They think they're weak. They think they're not okay. They don't realize that other men are also harboring private thoughts and private emotions and private conflicts. Is it because men are brought up this way? That might be part of the picture. When little boys cry, they may be more likely than little girls to be told that big kids don't cry. Little boys might be told growing up that they need to be strong. But there's a reason why little boys are often told that growing up, and it's because if they express their emotions, if they express their weakness as adults, they don't get the outpouring of support that most women do. Peers growing up might make fun of them. Peers in business will look down upon them. Many, not all, but many women will be put off by men expressing weakness and emotionality. Look at all the women who feel perfectly comfortable talking about how they drink or bathe in men's tears, or belittling men's concerns when they talk about them online. Men aren't lauded for talking about their mental health troubles. For Pete's sake, look at the kind of language being used in this document that I'm criticizing right now. If you're approaching men's mental health from a position of claiming that there's something wrong with them, that they're the ones who are deficient in some way, that they need to change their fundamental traits, do you really think that they're going to feel especially welcome to open up? Or do you think that they might end up feeling more insecure about themselves, more confused, even less able to appreciate aspects of themselves that they might have previously seen as positives? Maybe it's not men who need to change, or at least not just men. After all, I don't want to exclude the idea that men can want to better themselves just like anyone else. Maybe people like those who drafted these guidelines or this article ought to change. Maybe society in general needs to get off this toxic masculinity kick that it's been on for the past few years and start realizing that men have a variety of ways of dealing with their problems and relating to others just like women. Maybe we're the ones who need to be more adaptable and supportive. And maybe, just maybe, if we can show support for men in the way that they need, then they might feel less isolated and alone. Then they might feel more comfortable with openly expressing their mental health concerns. That's going to be the end of this segment for now. It's hard to believe how much wrong there is in this article, but it's even harder to believe that there's more yet to come. However, that's going to have to wait until next time. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.